Imagine being alone in a school in the middle of the night. The empty hallways, the flickering lights, and a silence so deep you can hear your own breathing. Now, imagine that silence being broken by something impossible. Footsteps echoing down the corridor, whispered children's laughter carried by the wind, and names writing themselves on the board. That's exactly what happened to Professor Daniel. He stayed late grading papers, but as the hours passed, he realized he wasn't alone. Something, or someone, still roamed those hallways. And that night, he would uncover the truth the school tried to bury. If you love chilling horror stories, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next videos. Now, put on your headphones, turn off the lights in your room, because another Beyond the Veil is about to begin. Daniel was exhausted. The clock in the corner of the screen read 11:47 p.m., and the stack of papers on his desk seemed endless. He had always hated taking work home, so he preferred to finish everything right there in the empty school. But that night, the silence felt different. The only sound was the faint scratching of his pen on paper, until he heard a soft tap on the door. He frowned and looked up. Nothing. Probably the wind. He sighed and went back to work, but the noise came again. A long, slow scratch, like nails dragging across wood. This time, he stood up. The teacher's lounge was one of the last rooms in the hallway, and at this hour, no one else should be there. He opened the door and peeked outside. Empty. The dark corridor stretched before him, lit only by the flickering lights. A shiver ran down his spine, as if someone was watching him. He took a step out, trying to listen more closely. Nothing but the distant hum of a fan spinning in some empty classroom. Maybe he was just hearing things. Stress, exhaustion, any rational explanation would do. He shook his head, chuckled at himself, and returned to his desk. But then, the name started appearing on the board. At first, just a single name written in white chalk. Lucas. Daniel blinked a few times, trying to remember if it had been there before. Probably some student had written it earlier, right? He grabbed the eraser and wiped the board clean. But before he could turn back to his desk, another name appeared before his eyes, traced by an invisible hand. Mariana. His blood ran cold. The chalk moved on its own, scratching across the black surface with quick, firm strokes. Another name appeared, then another. Lucas, Mariana, Rafael, Beatriz, Eduardo. Daniel took a step back, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. What was happening? A projector? A prank? He glanced around, searching for any logical explanation. His gaze landed on the open door, and for a brief moment he was certain he saw a shadow move in the hallway. Taking a deep breath, he pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the empty corridor. A knot tightened in his stomach. He needed to get out of there. When he turned to grab his things, every single chair in the room was flipped upside down. He hadn't heard a thing. No dragging sounds, no movement. And yet, all the furniture had shifted while his back was turned. A chill crawled up his spine. His instincts screamed at him to run. But before he could take a single step, the lights flickered violently, throwing the room into a chaotic dance of light and shadow. And that's when he saw it. In the reflection of the window, a child stood behind him. Daniel's heart slammed against his ribs. He spun around instantly, but no one was there. The reflection, however, still showed the figure standing there, watching him with empty eyes. His body locked up. He couldn't breathe, couldn't blink. And then, he realized something even worse. The child wasn't alone. More silhouettes began emerging around it. Small, pale faces, misty forms that seemed to blend into the darkness. They didn't move. They just watched. A shiver ran down his spine as one of the children tilted its head slightly. And then, without warning, the lights went out completely. Daniel was plunged into total darkness. The only sound was his own ragged breathing. He fumbled desperately for his phone, trying to turn the flashlight back on. When he felt it, cold hands gripped his shoulders. He screamed and stumbled backward, crashing into one of the chairs. At that exact moment, the lights flickered back on, weak and unsteady. The reflection in the window was gone. But he knew he wasn't alone. Whatever was there wanted to be seen. Daniel felt his chest rise and fall in irregular breaths. The shock of the icy touch still burned on his skin, and the unbearable sensation of being watched made his stomach churn. He swallowed hard and forced his feet to move backward until he felt the desk pressing against his back. The lights were still flickering weakly, casting distorted shadows on the walls. The teacher's lounge felt narrower, suffocating, as if the room itself was alive. And the silence was now absolute. Not even the hum of the lights, the creak of the chairs, or the sound of his own breathing seemed to belong to that moment. Then a noise. Tick, tick, tick. A dripping sound coming from the hallway. Daniel glanced at the half-open door. The entire school should have been empty. But then, the sound changed. The dripping turned into footsteps, slow, dragging. Each step was followed by a faint creak, as if someone barefoot was walking across the waxed floor. Daniel wanted to run, wanted to scream, but his feet were rooted to the ground, as if invisible roots held him in place. The door creaked open a little more, moving on its own. The dim hallway lights flickered in rhythm, and with each pulse, Daniel saw something approaching. First, a silhouette, small, short, perhaps a child. But then another appeared beside it, and another, 5, 6, 10. They emerged from the shadows, their bodies surrounded by a dense mist, as if the very air around them was corrupted. Daniel's stomach twisted. He recognized those faces, the names on the board: Lucas, Mariana, Rafael, Beatriz, Eduardo. They were students, or rather, they were the students who died there. The local news had reported on it years ago. A tragedy, a fire in the old wing of the school, where part of the ceiling collapsed. Some children were trapped in the flames and never made it out. Every teacher from that time spoke about the incident as if it were forbidden, something meant to be forgotten. But they didn't forget. The ghosts were there, standing, watching him, with eyes devoid of light, color, or life. Daniel opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. What did they want? Why were they there? One of the ghosts, a thin boy wearing a charred school uniform, slowly raised his hand and pointed at him. "Can you hear us?" The voice didn't come from his mouth. It echoed inside Daniel's head, a whisper coming from all directions at once. The other ghosts tilted their heads as if waiting for an answer. Daniel felt his throat go dry. This couldn't be happening. He squeezed his eyes shut, muttering to himself, "This isn't real. This isn't real. This isn't real." Bam! A loud bang made him jump. The blackboard behind him was now covered in hastily scrawled words, as if dozens of hands had written at the same time. "Help us." Daniel felt every hair on his body stand on end. What did that mean? Help them? How? The ghost took a step forward in perfect synchronization. He wanted to run, but something stronger held him in place. This school wasn't going to let him leave until he did what they needed. The students' faces began to change. The mist around them thickened, their eyes darkened, and their mouths opened wide, as if trying to scream. But no sound came out. The room grew ice cold. Daniel's breath turned to mist and his muscles tensed. Something deep inside him knew that if he didn't understand what they wanted, he wouldn't make it out of there alive. Daniel felt an unusual weight on his chest, as if he were being crushed by an invisible force. The figures before him, those ghostly children, continued to move slowly toward him. The room was now immersed in absolute silence, and the air felt dense, heavy with the sense of despair that suffocated him with each breath. He tried to step back, but his legs wouldn't respond, as if they were paralyzed. His eyes couldn't look away from the distorted faces of the children. The ghosts seemed more real by the second. Lucas, the first to approach, was so close that Daniel could see the empty expression in his eyes. His school uniform was scorched, and the skin on his face was decomposed, as if touched by fire. Mariana, a blonde girl with braids, stood beside Lucas, her gaze distant and fixed. She reached out toward Daniel, but he couldn't touch her. His body trembled, a mixture of fear and despair. The figure of Raphael appeared in his peripheral vision, wearing a school jacket stained with ash. His hollow stare seemed to pierce through Daniel's soul. He could hear his own breath, quick and heavy, mixing with the subtle sound of his own heartbeat. A primal fear settled deep in his mind, the feeling that he was at the center of something much larger, something he didn't understand. Then, Lucas' voice echoed again, but this time it wasn't just a simple question. "You can't escape us, Daniel." The words dragged through his mind, reverberating in his consciousness, like a distorted scream carried by the wind. Daniel opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. He looked around, trying to find a way out, but the walls seemed to be closing in on him, making the space feel smaller and smaller. Fear consumed him entirely, but there was something else, something he couldn't identify. A feeling that he was being tested, as if this was part of something far greater than just a simple ghostly encounter. He didn't know if he could endure much longer, if he could withstand the weight of all those eyes. But something inside him also knew that the only way out was to face the truth these spirits wanted to reveal. And then he spoke, his voice hoarse and barely audible, breaking the suffocating silence around them. "What do you want from me?" The ghost stopped moving. All eyes turned to him. The silence was deafening, but something changed at that moment. The tension in the air intensified, as if an invisible thread was being stretched to its breaking point. Lucas took a step forward, his dark eyes locked onto Daniel's, as if trying to pierce through his soul. "The truth." Lucas' voice was clearer now, but still distant, as if coming through a tunnel. "You need to understand the truth." Daniel's fear grew stronger. He could feel his mind on the verge of collapsing under the pressure. But he knew, deep down, that the only way out was to listen and understand. But what was the truth? What did these children want him to know? What could he do for them? Then, a new voice echoed in Daniel's mind. It was Beatrice, a girl with curly hair, wearing a faded school logo on her blouse. She stepped closer to Daniel, her eyes empty but filled with a deep sadness. "We weren't just victims." Her words came out disjointed, as if she struggled to communicate. But Daniel heard her. He heard her clearly. Beatrice was trying to tell him something important, something he needed to understand. But what? What happened? "What do you want me to understand?" Daniel asked, his voice trembling but determined. He needed to know. Mariana stepped forward, placing a pale, cold hand on Daniel's shoulder. Her eyes glowed, but not in a threatening way. She seemed to be asking for help. The pain in her gaze was almost tangible. "We are trapped," she sighed. "Trapped in the school, on that day, in that fire." Daniel felt his stomach twist. Her words started to make sense. He knew about the tragedy that happened at the school, but he had never imagined what the victims might have gone through. The fire, the despair, the panic. He knew the children had died, but he never knew how much they were still there, bound to that place of pain and suffering. "We couldn't leave." Raphael's voice was sharp, filled with bitterness. "We were forgotten, abandoned. Our suffering never ended. The teacher's lounge seemed to warp as the ghost spoke. The walls, once solid, now curved around him, distorted by a ghostly heat. The blackboard was darker than ever, as if absorbing the very essence of darkness. The ghosts were revealing the truth, and Daniel was beginning to understand. They didn't want revenge. They didn't seek harm. They just wanted to be heard. They wanted relief, something they were never able to find while they were alive. "Daniel, you can help us." Lucas' tone was soft, almost pleading. "Help us move on. Help us leave." Daniel felt a weight lifting from his heart. He didn't know how, but now he understood what needed to be done. To help them, he would have to face them. He would have to guide them beyond the veil, to the place where they could finally rest in peace. He stepped forward. His eyes were filled with understanding. He knew what needed to be done, what the ghosts needed. "I will help you." The room fell silent once more, but this silence was different. There was no more fear, no more pain, only a feeling of serenity, as if the souls of the ghosts had finally found a light at the end of the tunnel. And Daniel knew that by helping them, he was also freeing himself from something within. The figures of Lucas, Mariana, Raphael, Beatrice, and the others began to fade, their forms becoming ethereal, almost invisible, as the school around Daniel returned to normal. The oppressive tension dissipated, and he found himself back in the teacher's lounge, alone, but with a lighter heart. He knew that somehow he had done the right thing, and now those spirits could finally rest. The silence that filled the teacher's lounge was heavy, yet comforting. The tension that had lingered throughout the night had finally dissipated. Daniel looked around, sensing the presence of the ghosts now as a distant memory, as if their souls had finally found the rest they had long sought. The room, once a place of horror and despair, was now immersed in a soft peace, as if the very air had been cleansed of the dense energies that had surrounded it. A deep relief washed over him, not just because he had helped those lost souls move on, but because he had found a sense of personal liberation as well. The fear, anxiety, and anguish that had once tormented him were gone, and he realized that he too had been touched by something far greater. He hadn't just helped those trapped between worlds. He had also found the peace he had been searching for. With his heart still racing, Daniel looked toward the door of the teacher's lounge, hearing the distant sound of footsteps echoing down the corridors. Normal footsteps, as if the world around him had finally returned to its usual rhythm. The last traces of the spirits he had helped faded away, like smoke in the wind. But he knew that, even though the ghosts had departed, the impact of his journey that night would stay with him forever. He sat down in his chair and took a deep breath. The events of that night would be forever etched in his memory, but he no longer feared the unknown. He understood that true strength lay in facing fear, in seeking answers, in helping those who could no longer help themselves. Before standing up, Daniel took one last glance at the corners of the room where the ghostly figures had once stood. The burning fear that had once consumed him was now replaced by a sense of serenity. He had fulfilled his purpose that night. He had given the spirits a chance to move on, and in doing so, he had also found his own peace. As he left the room, he felt that in some way, something still lingered with him. Not fear, not anguish, but a sense of connection to the beyond. Something he could never fully explain, yet something that would help him face whatever the future held. Now, if you've made it this far, leave a like to show that you enjoyed the video. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications, because there are plenty more terrifying stories coming your way.